My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 36. 2 weeks ago, my parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with a single handwritten warning taped to the lid. Do not open this in front of anyone. Do not call us after you do. I opened it anyway, and 30 seconds later, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 6 months that came before it. The 6 months my parents spent slowly disappearing from my life, while pretending everything was fine. Before I get into it, if you're the kind of person who sticks around for the whole story, hit subscribe. But only if you actually mean it. And drop your city and what time it is where you are. I read every comment. I live alone in Asheville, North Carolina, in a small blue craftsman house I bought 4 years ago after my divorce finalized. It's mine. The first thing that's ever been entirely mine. No joint account, no cosigner, no shared name on the deed. I work as a structural engineer for a firm downtown, which matters later because it's the reason I know exactly what a building's bones look like when something underneath them is wrong. My parents, Diane and Marcus Whitfield, live 40 minutes away in a gated community outside Hendersonville. They retired early. My father sold his half of a construction company he'd built for 30 years, and the money let them build a life that looked, from the outside, like a postcard. Golf on Wednesdays, wine club on Fridays, a daughter, me, who they described to their friends as doing wonderfully whenever anyone asked. The problem is, they hadn't actually spoken to me in real terms for almost half a year. It started small. My mother stopped calling on Sundays, which had been our standing ritual since I was in college. When I called her instead, she'd answer distracted, distant, always in the middle of something. Can't talk long, honey. We're heading out. I told myself people's routines change. People get busy. Then my father missed my birthday. Not forgot, missed. He texted 2 days later. Sorry, been slammed. Happy belated. Slammed doing what? I never found out, because when I asked, he changed the subject to a fence he was building. The strangest part wasn't the distance. It was the small, specific details that didn't add up. In March, I drove out to Hendersonville, unannounced to drop off a birthday gift for my father, an anniversary edition fishing reel he'd mentioned wanting. Their driveway had a new gate installed, one that hadn't been there 2 months earlier. A keypad entry system, the kind you'd see on a corporate building, not a suburban house. When I buzzed, my mother's voice came through the intercom, oddly formal. Claire? Is something wrong? No, I just wanted to drop off Dad's gift. A pause too long for a simple yes. We're not really set up for visitors right now. Can you just leave it by the mailbox? I stood there in my car in their driveway, holding a wrapped fishing reel, being told to leave it by the mailbox like a delivery driver. I left it. I didn't push. That was my first mistake. The first of many nights I spent making excuses for behavior that, if a friend described it to me, I would have called a red flag immediately. In April, I found out through a neighbor, not my parents, that they'd sold their boat. A boat my father had owned for 11 years, the one he used to take me out on as a kid to teach me to fish. He'd sold it without mentioning it, without a word. In May, my mother's sister, my Aunt Ruth, who I'd always been close to, called me out of nowhere. Claire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, okay? Has your mother said anything to you about restructuring things? Financially? I told her no, that my parents barely spoke to me these days, let alone about finances. Ruth went quiet in a way that scared me more than anything she could have said. I think you need to pay closer attention to what's happening out there, Claire. I've tried calling Diane directly. She won't take my calls anymore either. I asked her what she meant. She said she wasn't sure yet, but something felt wrong, and she'd been feeling it for months. I should have listened harder that day. Instead, I told myself Ruth was probably overreacting, that my parents were just going through some private adjustment period, that eventually the Sunday calls would come back and everything would return to normal. 2 weeks after that call, I drove out again, this time without calling ahead, parking down the street instead of pulling into the driveway and walking the last stretch on foot. I don't fully know what instinct made me do that. Maybe it was the gate. Maybe it was Ruth's voice. What I saw from the sidewalk stopped me cold. There were 2 moving trucks in my parents' driveway. Not the kind you rent for a weekend move. Commercial trucks, the kind used for estate liquidations. Men in matching polos were carrying furniture out of the house. Furniture I recognized. The dining table I grew up eating dinner at. My mother's grandmother's china cabinet. I stood on that sidewalk for almost 10 minutes, just watching strangers empty my childhood home into trucks, while my parents were nowhere in sight. I finally called my mother.
She picked up on the 4th ring, her voice tight. "Claire, now isn't a good time. Mom, there are moving trucks at your house. What's going on?" Silence. Then carefully, like she was reading from a script. "We're downsizing. It's not a big deal. We'll explain everything soon." "Explain what? Mom, talk to me." "Not right now, Claire. Please. We'll be in touch." She hung up before I could say another word. That was the last real conversation I had with either of my parents for almost 7 weeks. Calls went unanswered. Texts got one-word replies, days late. My father, who used to call me every time his favorite football team lost just to complain about the refs, went completely silent. I threw myself into work during those weeks, telling myself that whatever was happening, it wasn't my business to force my way into. I'd learned over the years that pushing my parents when they decided to shut a door rarely ended with the door opening faster. It usually just meant I got blamed for pushing. Then, exactly 7 weeks after I watched those moving trucks pull away, I came home from work on a Tuesday evening to find a single wrapped box sitting on my front doorstep. No delivery slip, no shipping label, no note explaining who dropped it off. Just the box itself, a plain brown package about the size of a shoebox, wrapped clumsily in packing tape, and a single index card taped to the top in my mother's handwriting. "Do not open this in front of anyone.
Do not call us after you do." I stood on my own porch, keys still in my hand, staring at that card for what felt like a very long time. Whatever was inside that box, my parents had gone to considerable trouble to make sure I received it privately, and to make sure that whatever happened after I opened it, they wouldn't be the ones answering the phone. I should have called someone right then, before I even touched the tape. Instead, I carried the box inside, set it on my kitchen counter, and reached for a knife to cut it open, with absolutely no idea that in less than a minute, I'd be the one dialing 911, my hands shaking too hard to get the address out clearly the first time. The knife slid through the packing tape easily, and for a second, nothing about the box looked unusual. Bubble wrap, a layer of shredded paper padding, the kind of careful packing you'd use for something fragile. Then I saw what was underneath, and my stomach dropped straight through the kitchen floor. It was a manila folder, thick, bound with a rubber band. On top of it sat a small black flash drive with a strip of masking tape across it, and on the tape, in my father's handwriting this time, 3 words: "For the record." I set the knife down. My hands were already unsteady, and I hadn't even opened the folder yet. Inside were documents, dozens of them. Property deeds, bank statements with names I didn't recognize, a series of notarized letters, and near the bottom, a stack of photographs that made the air leave my lungs entirely. The photos showed my parents' house, the same house I'd grown up in, but staged differently than I remembered it. Empty rooms, boxes stacked against walls, and in several of the photos, a man I didn't recognize, standing in my parents' living room, gesturing at things like he was assessing value. In the corner of one photo, barely visible, was a date stamp. 9 months earlier. 9 months. Long before my mother stopped calling on Sundays. Long before any of this had supposedly started. I flipped through the bank statements next, my engineering brain automatically trying to make the numbers make sense, the way I'd trace load calculations on a blueprint. 3 accounts I'd never heard of, all opened in the same 6-week window last year. Transfers moving in and out, always just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, and listed as a secondary signer on 2 of those accounts, alongside my mother's name, was someone else entirely, a name I recognized immediately because it belonged to my father's business partner from 30 years ago, a man named Del Ashford, who I hadn't heard mentioned since I was a teenager. I remembered Del vaguely, a loud, charming man who used to come to our house for cookouts before he and my father had some falling out I was never told the details of. I hadn't thought about him in over a decade. The next document in the folder was a notarized letter, dated 4 months ago, addressed to an attorney I didn't recognize. I read it twice before the words fully landed. It was a power of attorney, signed by my mother, granting Del Ashford authority over specific financial decisions regarding my parents' estate. Decisions that, according to the letter's language, would take effect under certain conditions the document didn't spell out clearly, but which seemed to hinge on something called a triggering event. I didn't understand yet what that meant. What I understood was that my mother had quietly signed away partial control of decades of family assets to a man my father hadn't spoken to in years, and neither of them had said one word to me about any of it. At the very bottom of the folder was a single handwritten page, my father's handwriting, longer than anything he'd written to me in years.
Claire, if you're reading this, it means we ran out of time to explain it the way we wanted to. Del came back into our lives 11 months ago, claiming he had proof of an old business debt we owed him. Money from the company sale that he said was legally his. We didn't believe him at first. Then he showed us documents that looked real enough that our lawyer told us to take it seriously. He's been slowly maneuvering your mother into signing things, isolating us from people who might tell us to stop, including you. We didn't tell you because he made it very clear, more than once, that involving you would make things worse for all of us. We've spent months quietly building a case against him instead of fighting him directly, because fighting him directly got us nowhere the 2 times we tried. This box is everything we've collected. If something happens to us or if we go quiet again, take this straight to the police and to a lawyer named Patricia Voss in Asheville. Her number is on the last page. Do not try to contact Del yourself. Please forgive us for the distance. We thought we were protecting you. I read that letter 3 times, standing in my kitchen, before the shaking in my hands turned into something closer to panic. My engineer's mind, the part of me that spends all day identifying structural weak points before buildings fail, was already assembling the pieces. The gate, the moving trucks, the unfamiliar bank accounts. 7 weeks of silence. A man from my father's past resurfacing with documents proving a debt. My mother signing legal authority over to him. And now this box, delivered like a last resort, with an explicit instruction not to call them after I opened it. Because I understood suddenly, they might not have been able to safely answer. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number first. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I tried my father. Same thing. I tried again, twice more each, hands trembling so badly I fumbled the numbers once and had to start over. Nothing. I thought about the letter's instructions. Go straight to the police, don't contact Del myself. But standing alone in my kitchen at 7:40 on a Tuesday evening, with no idea whether my parents were simply avoiding my calls or something far worse, I did the only thing that felt immediate enough. I called 911. 911? What's your emergency? My voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hands were still shaking around the phone. I think my parents might be in danger. I have documents suggesting they've been the target of some kind of financial coercion, possibly by someone with a history of manipulation, and I can't reach either of them by phone. The dispatcher asked calm, methodical questions. My parents' address, when I'd last spoken to them, whether I had reason to believe they were in immediate physical danger right now versus a financial or legal matter that needed different handling. I answered as clearly as I could, though half of what was in that folder still didn't fully make sense to me.
She told me a patrol unit would do a welfare check at my parents' address within the hour, and that given the documents I was describing, I should also contact an attorney and consider reaching out to the county's financial crimes unit separately. I hung up and immediately called the number on the last page of my father's letter, Patricia Voss. It was after hours. I left a voicemail that came out more frantic than I intended, explaining who I was, who'd referred me, and that I needed to speak with her as soon as possible about a possible case of elder financial exploitation involving my parents. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, the folder spread out in front of me, and waited for someone, anyone, to call me back and tell me my parents were safe. The waiting was the worst part. 40 minutes crawled by in near silence, my phone gripped so tightly in my hand that my knuckles had gone pale, every notification sound making my heart lurch before I even checked what it was. When my phone finally rang at 8:26 p.m., the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, and for a moment, I couldn't make myself answer it. I answered on the third ring, my voice barely holding steady. "Hello? Miss Whitfield? This is Officer Reyes with the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. I'm calling regarding the welfare check you requested for Marcus and Diane Whitfield." My whole body went rigid. "Are they okay?" "They're both safe," he said, and the relief that hit me was so sudden I had to grip the edge of the kitchen table. "We found them at the residence. Your mother answered the door. Your father was there as well, both unharmed physically." Then why weren't they answering my calls? Why haven't they spoken to me in weeks?
There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me the answer was more complicated than a simple explanation. "Ma'am, I can't get into all the details over the phone, but I'll tell you this much. Your parents have been dealing with a situation that involves an outside party, and it appears they've been under significant pressure to limit contact with people outside their immediate household. Your mother specifically mentioned you by name and said she was relieved you'd reached out to us." "Is this about Del Ashford?" The pause this time was longer. "I'm not able to confirm details of an active matter, but I'd strongly encourage you to have that conversation directly with your parents once things settle, and to keep in contact with the attorney's office you mentioned reaching out to. We're referring this to our financial crimes division, given what you described and what we observed at the property." "Can I talk to them? Can I see them?" "Your mother asked me to pass along a message. She said, and I'm reading this directly, 'Tell Claire we're safe. We're so sorry, and we'll call her the moment it's safe to do so. Not tonight. Soon.'" I closed my eyes, my throat tight. "Officer, please, is my mother in some kind of danger from this person? Should I be worried about tonight specifically?" "We're not going to leave the residence unmonitored tonight," he said, which told me everything the polite phrasing was trying not to say directly. "I'd ask you to trust that we're handling the immediate situation. The paperwork you have, the folder, hold on to every piece of it, and get it into your attorney's hands as soon as possible. It may end up being the most important evidence in this case." I thanked him, hung up, and sat in my kitchen in the sudden, ringing silence that follows a crisis when the immediate danger passes, but nothing is actually resolved. Patricia Voss called me back 40 minutes later, apologizing for the late hour, her voice sharp and focused in a way that made me trust her instantly. "Miss Whitfield, I need you to bring me everything in that folder first thing tomorrow morning. Don't photograph it and send it electronically. Bring the physical originals, and don't let anyone else handle them in the meantime. Do you know who Del Ashford is? My father's letter said he claimed some old debt from a company sale." Patricia exhaled slowly on the other end. "I don't know the specifics of your father's history with him, but the name is familiar to me from a case I consulted on 2 years ago. A different family, similar pattern. Someone reconnects with an old associate, produces documents claiming money is owed, isolates the couple from outside relationships while pressuring them to sign over financial control to settle the debt quietly. If it's the same person operating the same pattern, this isn't the first time,
and it likely won't be prosecuted as a simple contract dispute. You think it's a scam? I think, she said carefully, that the pattern you've described, a resurfaced relationship, forged or manipulated urgency, isolation from family, transfers structured to avoid reporting thresholds, and a power of attorney signed under pressure, is a very well-documented form of elder financial exploitation. And the fact that your parents secretly built a case against him instead of confronting him directly tells me they were afraid of exactly what would happen if they pushed back too hard, too fast.
I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m., going through every page in that folder again, this time slower, cataloging dates against the timeline I'd pieced together myself, the gate installation, the missed birthday, the boat sale, the moving trucks, Ruth's warning call. Every strange, hurtful gap in contact over the past 6 months suddenly reorganized itself into something that made a devastating kind of sense. My parents hadn't been pulling away from me. They'd been trying to protect me from someone they were terrified of, while quietly building the exact kind of paper trail that could eventually take him down. The next morning, I drove the folder straight to Patricia Voss's office before work, my hands still slightly unsteady on the wheel the entire way. She spent nearly 2 hours going through every document with a legal pad and a highlighter, occasionally pausing to ask me questions I couldn't fully answer, details only my parents would know. I want to bring your parents in for a joint meeting as soon as it's safe, she said finally. Based on what's here, I think we have enough to not only void that power of attorney, but potentially pursue criminal charges. But I need them here, in person, telling their side directly, because a case like this lives or dies on their testimony about coercion. 3 days passed before I heard from my mother directly. When she finally called, her voice sounded exhausted in a way I'd never heard from her before. Not distant this time, just worn down, like someone who'd been holding her breath for months
And had only just remembered how to exhale. Claire, she said, and then stopped, like she didn't know where to start after 7 weeks of silence. Mom, are you actually okay? We are now, I think. Claire, I need to tell you everything, and I need you to understand why we didn't. I already know most of it, I said quietly. I read the folder. I read Dad's letter. She was quiet for a long moment. Then you know we weren't trying to shut you out because we stopped caring. We were trying to keep the one person Del hadn't gotten his hands into yet as far away from this as possible. Mom, who is he? What does he actually want? There was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped again. Then my mother said something that made every piece of the last 6 months rearrange itself one more time, into a shape far worse than I'd imagined. Claire, Del isn't just an old business partner your father had a falling out with. There's something about him, about why he came back now, specifically now, that we haven't told the police yet. And once you hear it, you're going to understand why we were so afraid of what would happen if we said anything at all. I gripped the phone tighter. Mom, what are you talking about? What haven't you told the police? My mother's breath came shaky over the line. 11 months ago, Del didn't just show up claiming an old debt. He showed up with something else. Photographs, financial records from your father's old company, records that, if they were made public, made it look like your father had hidden money from a partnership dissolution 30 years ago. Money that technically should have gone to shared investors, including people connected to Del. Is that true? Did Dad actually do that? It's complicated, Claire. There was a settlement decades ago. Everyone signed off on it at the time. But the way Del framed the old paperwork, out of context, twisted just enough, it looked like fraud. Real, prosecutable fraud, even though it wasn't what actually happened. He told us if we didn't cooperate quietly, he'd take those documents to the state and to every person your father used to work with. Your father's name, his entire 30-year reputation, gone in a season. Whether the claim held up in the end or not, the damage would already be done. So you paid him?
We didn't pay him money at first. He wanted control, access to certain accounts, until, he said, the debt was settled his way. He said if we brought in a lawyer or told you or told anyone, he'd release the documents immediately as retaliation. We believed him. We'd already seen what he was capable of. I sat down hard at my kitchen table, the pieces reorganizing themselves yet again, faster than I could process them. That's why the gate went up, why you sold the boat, why you wouldn't let me in the driveway that day. He was watching the house, Claire.
I don't know how much or how closely, but we started assuming everything was being watched, every visit, every conversation. Isolating you wasn't cruelty. It was the only leverage we had left, making sure he had no reason to think you knew anything, no reason to ever come near you. And the box? Why now? Why not just tell the police everything from the start? My mother's voice cracked for the first time. Because 2 weeks ago, we finally found something that changes everything. Your father tracked down the original signed settlement documents from 30 years ago, the real complete ones, not the cherry-picked pages Dell had been using. Documents proving there was no fraud, that everything was settled fairly and legally at the time. We'd been quietly collecting proof for months, building exactly what Patricia is holding right now, specifically so we could go to the police with something solid instead of just our word against his. Why send it to me instead of taking it straight to the police yourselves? Because 2 days before we packed that box, Dell found out we'd been digging. He came to the house. He threatened us directly, said if anything happened to him legally, there'd be consequences for our family. And this time, he specifically mentioned you by name. Your father panicked. We didn't know if it was safe to go to the police ourselves without protection in place first. So we sent everything to you, somewhere he might not think to look immediately, with instructions to get it straight to law enforcement and a lawyer if we went silent, or if something happened to us. I felt sick. Mom, he threatened me, and you didn't call me?
We were trying to protect you the only way we knew how, even if it looked like abandonment from the outside. I am so sorry, Claire. I am so sorry we let you spend 7 weeks thinking we didn't want you in our lives. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside my kitchen window, the evening was settling into that particular blue-gray quiet, and I found myself thinking about every unanswered call, every clipped text, every moment I'd quietly absorbed as rejection, when it had actually been fear. I'm coming to Patricia's office with you, I said finally. Both of you. Tomorrow morning. And Mom, no more boxes. No more secrets, even if you think you're protecting me. If something is dangerous enough that you're isolating yourselves over it, I need to know. Immediately. Every time. Okay, she said. And for the first time in 7 weeks, she actually sounded like my mother again, instead of a stranger reading from a script. Okay, Claire. No more secrets. The next morning, my parents walked into Patricia Voss's office together, my father looking older than I remembered, my mother's hands trembling slightly as she sat down across from the desk. For nearly 3 hours, they laid out everything. The original threat, the forged framing of old documents, the isolation, the accounts, the power of attorney signed under duress, and finally, the newly recovered original settlement papers that undercut Dell's entire claim.
Patricia listened, took notes, and finally set down her pen. This is significantly more serious than a financial dispute. What you're describing is extortion, and depending on how the original documents were altered or selectively presented, likely fraud on his part, not yours. I want to bring in the county's financial crimes unit today, and I want law enforcement protection in place for your family while this moves forward. You did the right thing sending that folder, Claire. It may end up being the piece of evidence that unravels his entire case. Within the week, detectives had opened a formal investigation. Dell Ashford was brought in for questioning after the original, unaltered settlement documents were turned over, definitively disproving the fraud narrative he'd built his entire threat around.
It turned out he'd used the same manipulation pattern on at least one other family years earlier, a case that had gone unreported at the time, buried under the same fear and isolation my parents had experienced. 3 weeks after that first meeting in Patricia's office, I sat in the back of a county courtroom, watching Del Ashford's arraignment on charges of extortion, attempted fraud, and coercion. He looked smaller than I remembered from the few childhood cookouts I'd half forgotten. Not the looming threat who'd spent months rearranging my family's entire life from the shadows. Just a man in an ill-fitting suit, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room, including my parents, who sat 2 rows in front of me. The Financial Crimes Unit had done more digging in those 3 weeks than I could have imagined. It turned out Del's scheme with my parents wasn't a one-time desperate move. It was a pattern he'd refined over nearly a decade. Investigators found 2 other elderly couples in neighboring counties who'd handed over partial financial control under similar threats, both too frightened or too ashamed to report it, until detectives came asking questions with my parents' case as the thread that unraveled everything else.
The original, unaltered settlement documents my father had tracked down turned out to be the case's centerpiece. Once forensic accountants compared them to the selectively cropped pages Del had used to manufacture his fraud narrative, the entire foundation of his threat collapsed. There had never been a real debt. There had only ever been a convincing lie, dressed up in enough real paperwork to make 2 frightened, isolated people believe they had no other choice. My mother testified for nearly 2 hours during the preliminary hearing. I sat in the gallery and listened to her describe, in a steady voice that only cracked once, exactly how 11 months of quiet terror had unfolded. The driveway gate installed the week after Del's first visit. The boat sold to raise cash for an initial good faith payment that only bought them a few more months of his patience. The sleepless nights spent debating whether telling me anything at A would put a target on my back too. When it was my turn to speak, briefly, about receiving the box and what led me to call 911, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned in advance. For 7 weeks, I believed my parents didn't want me in their lives anymore. I spent that time assuming the silence meant I'd done something wrong, or that I'd simply stopped mattering to them. I want the record to reflect that the version of events I was living in during that time was completely wrong. And it was wrong specifically because 2 people who loved me were terrified enough of this man that they thought pushing me away was the only way to keep me safe. That fear is what he built his entire operation on. And I don't think people understand how effective that kind of isolation is until they've lived inside it. Del Ashford eventually took a plea agreement rather than risk trial with the amount of documented evidence stacked against him. The folder, the settlement papers, the testimony from 2 other families, and financial records showing the exact pattern of transfers just under reporting thresholds. He received 4 years, with restitution ordered to both my parents and the other families he targeted. Though everyone in that courtroom understood, restitution could never fully repay 11 months of quiet terror. My parents' recovery wasn't instant. It took months of untangling the financial mess Del had created, closing the accounts he'd had partial access to, formally voiding the power of attorney, rebuilding a sense of normalcy in a house that had spent almost a year feeling less like a home and more like a place under siege. But something else happened during those months, something I hadn't expected. My parents and I talked more in the 6 months following that arraignment than we had in the 6 months before it. My mother started calling on Sundays again, but differently this time. Not a ritual out of habit, but conversations where she actually told me things. Small worries and daily frustrations she used to keep to herself out of some old instinct to protect me from anything that looked like a burden.
My father, for his part, sat me down one afternoon on his back porch, the one overlooking the spot where his boat used to sit in the driveway, and told me something he'd never said directly in 36 years. "I thought protecting you meant keeping you out of anything hard," he said. "Your mother and I both did. We thought that's what good parents do. They absorb the difficult things themselves so their kids never have to. I understand now that all we actually did was leave you alone in the dark, wondering what you'd done wrong, while we handled something we should have trusted you to help carry. I think about that conversation often now, about how easily 7 weeks of silence had rewritten in my head an entire lifetime of love into something that felt like abandonment, about how close my parents came to facing Del Ashford alone, out of a misguided belief that isolating themselves, and me, was the only form of protection available to them. The wrapped box still sits in a drawer in my kitchen, empty now, the folder long since transferred into evidence storage, and then, eventually, into a fire-safe box my mother keeps at her house, as a strange kind of memorial to the year they almost lost everything to a man banking on their silence. I bought a new boat for my father last Christmas. Not the same one. Nothing could replace that. But a smaller one, just big enough for the two of us to take out on quiet mornings. We don't talk about Del much anymore. We don't need to. What we talk about now is everything we almost lost the chance to say to each other, back when silence felt safer than the truth.